When most people think about serial killers, the same names always come to mind: Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy. These are the monsters who've been dissected in countless documentaries, books, and Netflix series. But here's the thing that'll keep you awake tonight. Some of the most depraved, most calculating, most evil killers in history never became household names. Their stories were buried, forgotten, or simply overshadowed by flashier cases. But their crimes, just as horrific, their methods, just as twisted, their body counts, sometimes even higher. What you're about to hear are the stories of 5 serial killers who operated in the shadows, preying on society's most vulnerable while maintaining facades so convincing that neighbors, friends, and even family members never suspected the monsters living right beside them. These aren't the killers you've heard about on every true crime podcast. These are the ones who slipped through the cracks of public consciousness, leaving behind trails of bodies and broken families that investigators are still trying to piece together decades later. We're talking about a grandmother who turned her boarding house into a death trap, cashing Social Security checks while her tenants rotted in the backyard. A predator who stalked the streets of Calgary for years, leaving young women's bodies on remote roadsides before vanishing like smoke. A woman who giggled her way through confessions of poisoning 4 husbands and God knows how many relatives. An unsolved case that has haunted investigators for nearly 30 years, with 3 bodies dumped in the same remote valley and a killer who's never been caught. And a mother who turned the maternity ward into her personal hunting ground, smothering newborns with a smile on her face. These cases will disturb you. They'll make you question how evil can hide behind such ordinary faces, how communities can be terrorized by people who seemed so harmless, so trustworthy, so normal. But that's exactly why these stories matter, because the most dangerous predators aren't the ones who look like monsters, they're the ones who look like everyone else. Let's start with a story that proves sometimes the most dangerous place you can be is somewhere you're supposed to feel safe. Sacramento, California, 1988. The police are digging up a backyard, and what they're finding is going to make this quiet residential street infamous. Bodies, 7 of them, buried like garbage behind a modest boarding house run by a sweet old lady who handed out tamales to her neighbors and tended to her rose garden every morning. Her name was Dorothea Puente, and she was about to become known as one of California's most prolific serial killers. But here's what makes this case so chilling. Dorothea didn't look like a killer. She looked like everybody's grandmother. Gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, thick-framed glasses, vintage dresses that made her seem like she'd stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting. She spoke softly, smiled warmly, and dedicated her life to helping society's forgotten people. Alcoholics, homeless individuals, people struggling with mental illness. She opened her home to them, gave them beds, fed them home-cooked meals, and helped them navigate the bureaucracy of Social Security benefits. The community loved her, social workers trusted her, even the police saw her as a pillar of the neighborhood, someone who was genuinely making a difference in people's lives. What they didn't know was that Dorothea Puente was systematically murdering her tenants, burying them in her backyard, and continuing to cash their government checks long after they were dead. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was calculated, methodical murder disguised as compassion. Dorothea had perfected the art of targeting people who wouldn't be missed: drifters, addicts, people whose families had given up on them long ago, people who existed on the margins of society, invisible to almost everyone except the woman who was killing them. The case that finally brought her down started with a man named Alvaro Montoya, though everyone called him Bert. He was 52 years old, homeless, and struggling with alcoholism when social worker Judy Moyes placed him in Dorothea's care in February 1988. Judy had worked with Dorothea before. She trusted her. Bert seemed like he was in good hands. But then Bert stopped showing up to his meetings with Judy. When she called the boarding house, Dorothea's stories kept changing. First, Bert had gone to visit relatives in Mexico. Then he'd found work in another city. Then he'd simply decided to move on without telling anyone. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own, but together they painted a picture that made Judy increasingly uncomfortable. Judy's suspicions led to a welfare check, which led to questions, which eventually led to search warrants. When investigators started digging in Dorothea's backyard, they found Bert's body along with 6 others. Men and women who had trusted Dorothea with their lives, only to have those lives snuffed out by poison, strangulation, or both. But here's the most disturbing part of this story. Even after finding 7 bodies on her property, the police didn't immediately arrest Dorothea Puente. She was so convincing, so grandmotherly, so concerned about her missing tenants that investigators actually believed she might be another victim rather than the perpetrator. They let her go home that night, planning to continue their investigation in the morning. Big mistake. By the time they returned, Dorothea was gone. She'd fled to Los Angeles, sparking a 4-day manhunt that stretched all the way to the Mexican border. When they finally caught her, she was sitting calmly in a hotel bar, sipping coffee and reading a newspaper as if nothing had happened. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Dorothea's crimes. This wasn't just about 7 bodies in a backyard. This was about a woman who had been perfecting her killing technique for years, targeting the most vulnerable members of society and turning murder into a business model. Take the case of Everson Gilmouth, a 77-year-old retiree from Oregon who made the fatal mistake of falling for Dorothea while she was serving time for forgery. They corresponded for months, and when Dorothea was released, Everson drove his truck and trailer down to Sacramento to start a new life with the woman he thought he loved. In October 1985, Dorothea wrote to Everson's sister announcing their upcoming wedding, but Everson never made it to the altar. Instead, Dorothea hired a handyman to build what she claimed was a storage box, 6 feet long, 30 inches wide, 30 inches deep. She paid the handyman an $800 bonus for his work and even gave him Everson's red pickup truck, claiming Everson no longer needed it. Later, Dorothea hired the same handyman to dump the box in the Sacramento River. When a fisherman pulled it out of the water 3 months later and called police, they found Everson's decomposed remains inside. But it would be 3 more years before anyone connected the body to the missing retiree, and by then Dorothea had claimed several more victims. What made Dorothea so effective wasn't just her ability to choose the right victims. It was her understanding of human psychology. She knew that people wanted to trust her, wanted to believe that someone cared about the forgotten members of society. She cultivated an image of saintliness that made it almost impossible for anyone to suspect her of wrongdoing. She changed her appearance specifically to seem more innocent, letting her hair go gray, wearing vintage clothing, adopting the mannerisms of a sweet old lady. She held Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in her boarding house, helped people sign up for benefits, even gave money to tenants who were struggling. Every act of kindness was calculated to build trust, to make her seem like the last person who could hurt anyone. But behind that carefully constructed facade was a predator who saw her tenants not as human beings, but as sources of income. She would forge their signatures on benefit checks, cash them in her own name, and when the tenants started asking questions or threatening to report her, she would kill them. Poison in their food, drugs in their drinks, a pillow over their face while they slept. Then she'd bury them in the backyard and tell anyone who asked that they'd moved on to better things. The most chilling part of Dorothea's story isn't the murders themselves, it's how long she got away with it. For years, people disappeared from her boarding house without anyone noticing. Social workers assumed their clients had moved on. Family members, if there were any, figured their relatives had simply chosen to cut contact. The system that was supposed to protect society's most vulnerable had so many gaps that a serial killer could operate for years without detection. When Dorothea finally went to trial in 1993, her defense team tried to paint her as a caring woman who had simply been unlucky enough to have multiple tenants die of natural causes on her property. They pointed to her age, her appearance, her history of community service. How could this sweet grandmother be a cold-blooded killer? But the evidence was overwhelming. Massive amounts of poison in the victims' bodies, forged checks, lies that multiplied every time investigators asked questions. The jury saw through the facade and convicted her of 3 murders, though investigators suspected she was responsible for at least 9 deaths, possibly more. Dorothea Puente was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She died behind bars in 2011 at the age of 82, still maintaining her innocence, still insisting that all her tenants had died of natural causes, and she was just unlucky enough to have their deaths happen on her property. But the story doesn't end with her death. Her boarding house still stands in Sacramento, now owned by people who've turned its horrific history into a macabre tourist attraction. They've put up a Dorothea-like mannequin on the front porch, framed photographs documenting her crimes on the walls inside. People stop by multiple times every day to catch a glimpse of where some of Sacramento's most notorious murders took place. What lessons do we take from Dorothea Puente's story? That evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and dramatic music. Sometimes it wears glasses and bakes cookies and tends to rose gardens. Sometimes it targets the people society has already forgotten, knowing that their disappearances won't cause much of a stir. And sometimes it operates for years right under our noses, because we can't imagine that someone who looks so harmless could be capable of such horror. Dorothea Puente killed at least 9 people, possibly more. She turned compassion into a weapon, used society's desire to help the vulnerable as cover for systematic murder. She proved that the most dangerous predators aren't the ones who lurk in dark alleys. Now we cross from California's suburban nightmare into the frozen wilderness of Western Canada, where death stalked the streets of Calgary in the shadows of the Rocky Mountains. For almost 2 decades, 4 brutal murders haunted this prairie city, their victims left like discarded refuse on desolate roadways. The killer moved like smoke through the darkness, targeting the young and vulnerable before vanishing without a trace. His name was Gary Allen Sreri, and by the time investigators finally identified him, he had been dead for over a decade. Gary Allen Sreri was born in Oak Park, Illinois in 1942, but his early life reads like a blueprint for disaster. The kind of childhood that produces either broken souls or dangerous predators. By the time he reached adulthood, Sreri had already demonstrated a pattern that would define his existence, drifting from place to place, leaving chaos in his wake. He was charismatic when it suited him, opportunistic when it mattered, and utterly without conscience when the moment called for violence. In the early 1970s, Sreri found himself in legal trouble in the United States. He was supposed to appear in court, face the consequences of his actions like any civilized person would. Instead, he did what cowards and killers do best. He ran. Sreri fled across the border into Canada illegally, slipping through the cracks of a system that wasn't equipped to track every drifter who crossed into their territory. This was decades before digital records and sophisticated border monitoring. Back then, if you were clever enough and careful enough, you could disappear entirely. Once in Canada, Sreri became a ghost. He lived as a transient, primarily moving between Alberta and British Columbia, picking up work wherever he could find it. Cooking in greasy diners, selling whatever needed selling, always cash jobs, always under the table. He used aliases like other people used clothing, switching identities when the heat got too close, or when he simply felt like becoming someone else. His appearance changed constantly: hair length, facial hair, weight, clothing style. He understood instinctively that anonymity was survival, and survival was everything. But beneath this carefully constructed facade of normalcy lurked something far more sinister. Sreri wasn't just running from the law, he was hunting. And in the sprawling city of Calgary, surrounded by endless prairie and isolated mountain roads, he found the perfect hunting ground. The first victims were Eva Dvorak and Patricia McQueen, both just 14 years old. Students at Ian Bazalgette Junior High School, they were typical teenagers navigating the awkward territory between childhood and adulthood. On February 12th, 1976, they left school together and spent the day visiting friends, the kind of innocent wandering that defined teenage life in the 70s. By February 15th, they were walking near 9th Avenue and 12th Street Southeast in Calgary, heading toward downtown in the bitter cold of a prairie winter night. That's when they encountered Gary Allen Sreri. We'll never know exactly what he said to them, what lies he told to gain their trust. Maybe he offered them a ride out of the cold. Maybe he claimed to know their parents. Maybe he simply seemed like a harmless adult in a world where children were taught to trust grown-ups. Whatever his approach, it worked. The girls got into his vehicle, and by morning they were dead. Their bodies were discovered under the Happy Valley underpass, west of Calgary, lying together on the frozen ground. Both were fully clothed, both had been sexually assaulted, both had died from asphyxiation. The killer had made no attempt to hide the bodies or conceal his crime. Instead, he left them displayed like broken dolls, a message of contempt for the lives he had stolen and the community he had violated. Ava's mother was already devastated by the loss of her husband, just 4 years earlier in 1972. Now she faced the unimaginable horror of losing her daughter to a monster. Patricia, known as Patsy to those who loved her, was one of 11 children in a large, boisterous family. Her relatives described her as full of life, adventure, and curiosity. Those qualities, the very essence of what made her special, had been snuffed out by a predator who saw her only as an object for his twisted desires. But Sari wasn't finished. He had tasted blood, felt the rush of absolute power over another human being, and like all serial killers, he craved more. In the fall of 1976, he struck again. This time his target was Melissa Rehorick, a 20-year-old woman who had moved to Calgary from Windsor, seeking a fresh start in the West. She was living at a downtown YMCA and working as a housekeeper at a nearby hotel, the kind of honest, hard work that builds character and pays the bills. Melissa represented everything that Sari despised. She was young, independent, making her own way in the world. She had hopes, dreams, a future stretching out before her. On a September night in 1976, all of that ended when she crossed paths with a killer. Her body was found in a ditch along a gravel road on the western outskirts of Calgary. She had been strangled, and signs of a struggle covered her body. Unlike his younger victims, Melissa had fought back. She had refused to go quietly into the darkness, clawing and battling for her life until the very end. The final known victim was Barbara McLean, 19 years old and working at the same hotel where Melissa had been employed. It's chilling to think that Sari may have been watching both women, studying their routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Barbara was last seen walking alone from the hotel in the early hours of February 26, 1977. Just 6 hours later, a dog walker discovered her body in the area of 6th Street and 80th Avenue Northeast. The trauma to Barbara's body told a story of desperate resistance. She had fought back ferociously against her killer, blood on her left hand, foreign hairs on her body, numerous marks and bruises covering her skin. Like the others, she had been strangled, but she had made Sari work for it. She had refused to be an easy victim, and in her final moments, she may have left evidence that would eventually help identify her killer decades later. For years, these 4 murders haunted Calgary. The police worked tirelessly, following every lead, interviewing countless suspects, building profiles and theories. But Sari was too careful, too mobile, too good at disappearing. He would strike and then vanish, sometimes for years at a time, leaving investigators with nothing but bodies and questions. What they didn't know was that Sari had eventually returned to the United States, where his criminal career continued to escalate. In 2011, he died in an Idaho state prison while serving a life sentence for rape. With no family to claim his body, he was buried behind the institution in an unmarked grave, as anonymous in death as he had tried to be in life. The breakthrough came decades later, in 2021, when the RCMP and Calgary police formed a partnership to use cutting-edge investigative genetic genealogy. They re-examined evidence that had been sitting in storage for over 45 years, working with laboratories to develop a single DNA profile that could be uploaded to genealogy databases. Slowly, painstakingly, geneticists began building a family tree based on that profile. The trail led them to Gary Allen Sari. In September 2023, Idaho State Police confirmed that his DNA matched the unknown male profile from the Alberta killings. After nearly 5 decades, the monster finally had a name and a face, but the identification of Sari raised as many questions as it answered. This was a man who had lived illegally in Canada for years, working under aliases, constantly changing his appearance, moving from job to job and city to city. How many other crimes had he committed? How many other victims were there, living or dead, who had never been connected to his reign of terror? Investigators believe the answer is troubling. Sari was a transient who lived between Canada and the United States for decades, often changing his appearance and relying on multiple identities. His son Richard believes there are other crimes waiting to be uncovered, other families still searching for answers about loved ones who simply vanished without explanation. The Calgary serial killer case represents both the power and the limitations of modern forensic science. Technology that didn't exist when these crimes were committed finally provided the answers that investigators had sought for decades. But it also highlights the dark reality that monsters like Sari often take their secrets to the grave, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. Ava Dvorak, Patricia McQueen, Melissa Rehorek, and Barbara McLean were more than just victims of a serial killer. They were daughters, sisters, friends, young women with dreams and aspirations, and people who loved them. Their lives mattered, their deaths were not in vain, and their stories serve as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be served. Gary Allen Sari thought he had gotten away with murder. For decades, it seemed he was right. But evil leaves traces, and time has a way of revealing truth. In the end, the very DNA he left behind became his confession, his conviction, and his legacy. The truth is, the most dangerous killers aren't always the ones who make headlines. They're not the flashy psychopaths or the cult leaders who capture media attention. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, the trusted ones, the people who blend into society so perfectly that nobody suspects a thing. That's what makes today's cases so deeply unsettling. We're diving into the stories of killers who operated in plain sight, who used trust as their weapon, and whose crimes went unnoticed for far too long. Now we turn to one of the most chilling cases of serial murder disguised as compassion. Her name was Nanny Doss, but the media would come to know her by a different name, the Giggling Granny. And that nickname tells you everything you need to know about how disturbing this case really is. Because every time Nanny told the story of how she murdered her husbands, she laughed, not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable chuckle, a genuine, gleeful giggle, as if she was sharing the punchline to some twisted joke that only she understood. Picture this. It's 1954 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Samuel Doss, a 58-year-old Nazarene minister, comes home from work to find his wife Nanny waiting for him with dinner. She's a sweet grandmother figure, gray-haired and soft-spoken, the kind of woman who hands out homemade cookies to the neighbors and tends to her rose garden with loving care. Samuel has no idea that the woman serving him his evening meal has already buried 4 previous husbands. He has no idea that she's taken out 2 life insurance policies on his life, and he certainly has no idea that his dinner is about to be his last. Samuel takes a few bites, compliments his wife on her cooking, and settles in for what he thinks will be a quiet evening at home. Within hours, he's writhing in agony. His stomach feels like it's on fire. He's vomiting uncontrollably, sweating through his clothes, and struggling to breathe. Nanny, ever the caring wife, suggests they call a doctor. She holds his hand in the ambulance, whispers soothing words as he's rushed to the hospital, and maintains the perfect facade of a worried spouse throughout his treatment. The doctors diagnose severe food poisoning and keep Samuel for observation. After a few days of treatment, he seems to recover. The medical staff are satisfied with his progress, and Samuel is discharged on October 5th, 1954. He's weak but alive, grateful to be going home to his loving wife. What Samuel doesn't know is that Nanny is growing impatient. Those insurance policies won't pay out until he's actually dead, and she's already spent too much time on this particular husband. She needs to finish what she started. 7 days later, Samuel Doss is dead. Nanny plays the grieving widow perfectly, sobbing at his bedside, making funeral arrangements, and accepting condolences from friends and family. But this time, something goes wrong with her plan. Samuel's doctor is suspicious about the sudden death so soon after discharge. The symptoms don't add up. The timeline feels off. Against Nanny's protests, he orders an autopsy. What they find in Samuel's body is staggering. Enough arsenic to kill a horse, not trace amounts, not accidental poisoning. A massive, deliberate dose that could only have been administered by someone with direct access to his food and drink. The police arrive at Nanny's door within hours, and for the first time in decades of murder, the giggling granny's luck has finally run out. But here's what makes this case truly haunting. Samuel wasn't her first victim. He wasn't even close. When investigators start digging into Nanny's past, they uncover a trail of death that stretches back nearly 30 years. 4 husbands, her mother, her sister, her grandson, her mother-in-law, all dead under mysterious circumstances, all with Nanny right there to comfort them in their final moments, to collect their insurance money, and to play the grieving relative at their funerals. Nancy Hazel was born in 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama, into a world that seemed designed to break her from the very beginning. Her father, Jim, was a violent alcoholic who kept his daughters out of school to work on the family farm. He was controlling, abusive, and forbade his children from wearing makeup, nice clothes, or having any kind of normal social life. At age 7, Nanny suffered a severe head injury while riding a train, her skull slamming into a metal bar with enough force to cause lifelong headaches, and what many believe were personality changes that would shape her future. But even in that harsh environment, Nanny found an escape: romance magazines. She devoured them obsessively, particularly the Lonely Hearts columns, where desperate people searched for love and companionship. These magazines painted a picture of perfect relationships, of handsome men who would sweep women off their feet and provide the kind of life that seemed impossible in her abusive household. They became more than entertainment for Nanny. They became a blueprint for the life she believed she deserved. At 16, she married her first husband, Charlie Braggs, after knowing him for only 4 months. It was 1921, and Nanny thought she was finally escaping into the romantic life she'd read about in her magazines. Instead, she found herself trapped in another controlling household, this time dominated by Charlie's mother, who was every bit as abusive and demanding as Nanny's father had been. The couple had 4 children together, but in 1927, something terrible happened. Their 2 middle daughters died suddenly from what was officially ruled food poisoning. Charlie always suspected something wasn't right about those deaths. He'd noticed strange things about his wife: the way she would smile at inappropriate moments, The way she seemed almost excited when people got sick. The way she would volunteer to prepare food and drinks for anyone who was feeling unwell. When their daughters died, Charlie made a decision that probably saved his life. He took their oldest daughter and fled in the middle of the night, leaving baby Florine behind with Nanny. Years later, when asked why he left, Charlie would give a chilling answer. He said he was frightened of her. But Nanny wasn't discouraged by her first husband's departure. If anything, it reinforced her belief that she needed to find the right man, the perfect romantic partner who would give her the life she'd always dreamed of. She threw herself back into those lonely hearts columns, writing letters to potential suitors and crafting the perfect image of herself as a loving, caring woman who just wanted to find happiness. Her second husband was Robert Franklin Harrelson, and their marriage in 1929 seemed promising at first. But Robert turned out to be an alcoholic with a criminal record for assault. The fairy tale romance Nanny had imagined quickly soured into another nightmare of disappointment and abuse. The marriage lasted 16 years, but it ended the same way as many of Nanny's relationships would. Robert died suddenly and mysteriously, leaving behind a small insurance policy and a widow who seemed surprisingly calm about the whole situation. Husband number 3 was Arlie Lanning, a man Nanny met through her persistent letter-writing campaigns to Lonely Hearts columns. Arlie was a widower with children, and Nanny saw an opportunity to play the role of loving stepmother and devoted wife. But Arlie had a drinking problem, and worse, he had a wandering eye. When Nanny discovered he was having affairs, her romantic fantasy was shattered once again. Arlie died in 1952 under circumstances that were becoming depressingly familiar. Sudden illness, mysterious symptoms, a grieving widow who seemed more interested in insurance payouts than funeral arrangements. By the time she met Samuel Doss, Nanny had perfected her method. She knew exactly how much arsenic to use, how to mix it into food and drinks without detection, and how to play the concerned caregiver while her victims slowly died in agony. She'd learned to time the poisoning carefully, sometimes allowing her victims to recover partially before administering the final, fatal dose. This pattern made the deaths seem more natural, more like tragic illnesses rather than deliberate murders. But it wasn't just husbands who fell victim to Nanny's twisted sense of justice. Her own family wasn't safe from her rage and disappointment. When her mother came to live with her in the 1950s, the elderly woman became an inconvenience, too demanding, too needy, too expensive to care for. Nanny solved that problem the same way she solved all her problems. A little arsenic in the morning coffee, and suddenly her mother was no longer a burden. Her grandson Robert was just 2 years old when he died under Nanny's care. The official cause of death was listed as complications from pneumonia, but the timing was suspicious. The boy had been healthy just days before, playing and laughing like any normal toddler. The nanny volunteered to babysit while his parents worked, and by evening, little Robert was dead. His parents were devastated, grateful to have Nanny there to comfort them in their grief, never suspecting that the woman holding them while they cried had murdered their child. What made Nanny so dangerous wasn't just her willingness to kill, it was her ability to blend perfectly into the role society expected her to play. She was the devoted wife who nursed sick husbands back to health. She was the caring mother who helped with grandchildren. She was the responsible daughter who took in aging parents. Every murder was disguised as an act of love. Every victim died believing that Nanny was trying to save them. The arsenic was easy to obtain in the 1940s and 1950s. It was a common ingredient in rat poison, readily available at any hardware store or pharmacy. Nanny would buy it regularly, claiming she had problems with rodents on her property. She learned to mix it with sweet foods and drinks to mask the bitter taste, and she discovered that small doses over time could mimic the symptoms of common illnesses, like food poisoning or stomach flu. When investigators finally pieced together the full scope of Nanny's crimes, they realized they were dealing with one of the most prolific female serial killers in American history. She had been murdering family members for nearly 3 decades, collecting insurance money and inheritance payments while maintaining the perfect facade of a loving grandmother. The total body count would never be fully confirmed, but authorities suspected she was responsible for at least 11 deaths, possibly more. During her interrogation, Nanny showed no remorse whatsoever. In fact, she seemed to enjoy retelling the stories of her murders, giggling and smiling as she described how each victim had died. When asked why she killed her husbands, her answer was chillingly simple. They weren't romantic enough. They didn't live up to the fantasy she'd created from reading those romance magazines all those years ago. So she got rid of them and went looking for someone better. The case that finally brought down the giggling granny began with a simple medical decision. Samuel Doss's doctor, suspicious about the sudden death of a patient who had seemed to be recovering, made the choice to order an autopsy despite family objections. That decision revealed the massive amount of arsenic in Samuel's system and triggered an investigation that would expose decades of hidden murders. Nanny Doss was arrested in 1954 and charged with Samuel's murder. She initially denied everything, maintaining her role as the grieving widow who couldn't understand why anyone would suspect her of such horrible crimes. But when confronted with the physical evidence, when investigators showed her the autopsy results and began exhuming the bodies of her previous victims, her story began to change. One by one, the bodies of Nanny's victims were dug up and examined. One by one, the forensic evidence confirmed what investigators already suspected: massive amounts of arsenic in every corpse, enough poison to kill each victim several times over. The pattern was undeniable, and Nanny's decades of murder were finally exposed to the world. In 1955, faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, Nanny Doss pled guilty to the murder of Samuel Doss. Oklahoma chose not to pursue the death penalty because of her gender, a decision that reflected the social attitudes of the time. Instead, she was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Even in prison, Nanny remained unrepentant. She gave interviews to journalists, always with that same disturbing giggle, always insisting that her only crime was loving too much and expecting too much from the men in her life. She blamed her murders on the head injury she'd suffered as a child, claiming it had damaged her brain and made her unable to control her impulses. But her detailed planning, her careful timing, and her ability to evade suspicion for so long suggested a level of calculation that had nothing to do with brain damage. Nanny Doss died in prison in 1965 at the age of 59, succumbing to leukemia in the hospital ward of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. She had served 10 years of her life sentence, 10 years during which she never expressed genuine remorse for the 11 lives she had taken. Her death was quiet and unremarkable, nothing like the dramatic poisoning deaths she had inflicted on her victims. The story of the Giggling Granny exposes something deeply disturbing about the nature of evil. Nanny Doss wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. She didn't look dangerous. She didn't act threatening. She was a grandmother who baked cookies and tended gardens, who attended church and helped her neighbors. Now we turn to the most chilling case in our investigation, one that stretches across decades and continents, leaving a trail of bodies that investigators are still uncovering today. The Hemlock Valley murders represent something far more sinister than random violence. They reveal the terrifying reality of a predator who understood exactly how to exploit society's most vulnerable members, operating in the shadows while an entire community lived in fear. In the summer of 1995, British Columbia's Fraser Valley became the hunting ground for a killer who remains nameless to this day. Within just 2 months, 3 women's bodies were discovered in remote bush areas, each bearing the unmistakable signature of the same murderous hand. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated, methodical, and executed with the cold precision of someone who had done this before. The victims shared more than just their tragic fate. Tracy Olajede, Tammy Pipe, and Victoria Yunker were all women who had fallen through society's cracks. They worked the streets of Vancouver's downtown east side, struggled with addiction, and lived on the margins where disappearances often went unnoticed. The killer knew this. He understood that these women were perfect targets, not because they were easy prey, but because society wouldn't immediately mobilize to find them. Tracy Olajede was 30 years old when she vanished on August 10th, 1995. She was last seen near the Waldorf Hotel in downtown Eastside, a mother trying to escape the grip of crack cocaine addiction that kept pulling her back into the dangerous world she desperately wanted to leave. 2 days later, her nude body was found on a trail near Morris Valley Logging Road in Agassiz. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death, her body discarded like refuse in the wilderness. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community, but before investigators could fully process what they were dealing with, more bodies began to surface. Each victim told the same horrifying story. Each had been taken from the streets they knew, driven to remote locations they'd never seen, and murdered by someone who possessed intimate knowledge of the logging roads and hidden areas around Agassiz and Mission, more than 125 kilometers from where they lived. What makes these murders particularly haunting is the killer's apparent comfort level in downtown Eastside. This wasn't some outsider who swooped in to commit random acts of violence. Police believe the murderer interacted regularly with these women, perhaps even earning their trust before luring them to their deaths. He knew their routines, their vulnerabilities, their desperate circumstances. He used this knowledge as a weapon. The forensic evidence tells a story of calculated brutality. DNA from a possible suspect was recovered from both Tracy Olajede and Tammy Pipe. While investigators believe the same person killed Victoria Yunker, the similarities in evidence and methodology paint a picture of a serial killer who operated with terrifying efficiency. Each murder followed the same pattern: abductions from downtown Eastside, transportation to remote locations, sexual assault, strangulation, and disposal of the body with no attempt at concealment. But here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. The Hemlock Valley murders occurred during the same time period and in the same general area where Robert Pickton was beginning his own horrific killing spree. Pickton, who was eventually convicted of murdering 6 women and suspected of killing as many as 49, operated from his pig farm in Port Coquitlam. The proximity and timing have led investigators to believe that 2 separate serial killers were hunting in the same territory, targeting the same vulnerable population. Think about that for a moment. While one monster was feeding women to pigs on his farm, another was strangling them and dumping their bodies in the wilderness. The women of downtown Eastside were being hunted by multiple predators simultaneously, and nobody in authority seemed to notice or care enough to stop it. The investigation into the Hemlock Valley murders reveals the tragic reality of how society treats its most vulnerable members. These women weren't just statistics or case numbers. Tracy Olajade was a mother fighting addiction. Tammy Pipe had hopes and dreams beyond the streets. Victoria Yunker was a human being deserving of protection and justice. Yet their disappearances initially raised few alarms because they came from a world that mainstream society preferred to ignore. The killer understood this societal blindness and exploited it ruthlessly. He knew that sex workers and drug addicts could vanish without immediate police response. He knew that their families might not have the resources or connections to pressure authorities for answers. He knew that the media wouldn't give their deaths the same attention afforded to victims from more privileged backgrounds. This knowledge wasn't accidental, it was part of his hunting strategy. What's perhaps most terrifying about the Hemlock Valley case is that the killer has never been identified or caught. Despite having DNA evidence, despite understanding his methods and territory, despite decades of investigation, he remains a ghost. He could be dead, imprisoned for other crimes, or living quietly somewhere, his dark secrets buried with his victims. The families of Tracy, Tammy, and Victoria have been denied the closure that comes with seeing their loved one's killer face justice. The case also highlights the broader systemic failures that allow such predators to operate. The lack of resources devoted to investigating crimes against marginalized populations, the insufficient communication between different law enforcement agencies, and the societal attitudes that devalue certain lives all contributed to creating an environment where serial killers could hunt with relative impunity. Modern investigators continue to work these cases, hoping that advances in DNA technology and investigative techniques might finally unmask the Hemlock Valley killer. They've expanded their search, looking for similar crimes in other jurisdictions, building profiles based on the evidence they have. But time is not on their side. Witnesses die, memories fade, and evidence degrades with each passing year. The women who survived those terrifying months in 1995 still carry the trauma. Those who worked the same streets, who knew the victims, who lived with the constant fear that they might be next, they remember. They remember the whispered warnings, the buddy system that developed organically, the way everyone became a little more careful, a little more suspicious of strangers offering rides or easy money. Yet even as the community tried to protect itself, the killer's intimate knowledge of their world gave him advantages they couldn't overcome. He knew how to approach his victims, how to gain their trust, how to separate them from any potential help. He understood their desperation and used it against them, offering whatever they needed most before revealing his true intentions. The Hemlock Valley murders stand as a stark reminder that evil often wears a familiar face. The killer wasn't some Hollywood monster lurking in obvious shadows. He was someone who blended into the fabric of downtown Eastside, who could walk among potential victims without raising suspicion, who understood the unwritten rules of a world most people never see. Today, nearly 30 years later, the case remains open. 3 families still wait for answers. A community still bears the scars of those terrible months when death stalked their streets. And somewhere, the knowledge of what really happened on those remote logging roads in 1995 remains locked away, either in the mind of a killer who may never be found, or buried with secrets that died when he did. The Hemlock Valley murders force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we value human life, about who deserves protection and who gets forgotten. They remind us that monsters don't always announce themselves with obvious warning signs. Sometimes they hide in plain sight, patient and calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We've examined cases of killers who wore masks of respectability, but what happens when the mask isn't just a disguise, but becomes the weapon itself? What happens when a mother's love becomes the instrument of death? Mary Beth Tinning seemed like any other mother in suburban Schenectady, New York. She had that wholesome, caring demeanor that neighbors admired. She fussed over her children, rushed them to hospitals when they fell ill, and grieved publicly when tragedy struck. But between 1972 and 1985, 9 of her children died under mysterious circumstances. 9 children. And for over a decade, nobody questioned the grieving mother who seemed cursed by the cruelest twist of fate imaginable. The medical community called it tragic coincidence. The neighbors whispered about bad luck. But what they were really witnessing was one of the most calculated and cold-blooded killing sprees in American history, carried out by a woman who discovered that nothing brought her more attention, more sympathy, more raw human connection than the death of her own children. Mary Beth Rowe was born in 1942 in Duanesburg, New York, into a working-class family that struggled with emotional distance and dysfunction. Her father was absent, her mother was cold and withholding, and Mary Beth grew up starving for attention and affection. She was described by those who knew her as unremarkable, forgettable even. She wasn't particularly pretty, wasn't especially smart, wasn't memorable in any meaningful way. She was the kind of person who could disappear into a crowd without anyone noticing she was ever there. That invisibility ate at her. She craved recognition, validation, the feeling of being important to someone, anyone. When she married Joe Tinning in 1965, she thought she'd found her path to significance. They settled into a modest home in Schenectady, and Mary Beth threw herself into the role of devoted wife and mother. But even marriage couldn't fill the void inside her. She was still ordinary, still forgettable, still struggling with the gnawing feeling that she didn't matter. Then, in 1972, everything changed. Her daughter Jennifer was born with a rare genetic condition called Reyes syndrome. The baby was sick from birth, requiring constant medical attention, and Mary Beth found herself at the center of a whirlwind of doctors, nurses, and specialists. For the first time in her life, people were paying attention to her. They hung on her every word, asked about her feelings, offered comfort and support. When Jennifer died at just 8 days old, Mary Beth was devastated, but she was also something else. She was important. The grief was real, but so was the intoxicating rush of being the center of attention. At Jennifer's funeral, Mary Beth was surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors who showered her with sympathy and care. She felt seen, valued, significant. And somewhere in her twisted psyche, a dark realization took root. Her child's death had given her something she'd never had before, a starring role in her own life. 2 months later, her son Joseph Jr. died suddenly at 3 weeks old. The doctors called it sudden infant death syndrome. The community rallied around the Tinnings again, offering meals, comfort, and endless support. Mary Beth was once again the tragic figure at the center of everyone's attention. The coincidence was heartbreaking, but not impossible. Sometimes, the medical experts said, these things just happen, but they kept happening. Over the next 13 years, 7 more of Mary Beth's children would die under mysterious circumstances. Timothy, Nathan, Mary Frances, Jonathan, Michael, Mary Frances II, and finally Tammy Lynn. Each death brought the same pattern: a sudden illness, a frantic rush to the hospital, desperate attempts to save the child, and then grief-stricken Mary Beth surrounded by a community offering comfort and support. The method was always the same, though it took investigators years to recognize the pattern. Mary Beth would suffocate her children, usually by pressing a pillow over their faces or covering their nose and mouth with her hands. She was careful, methodical, patient. She would wait until they were alone, strike quickly, and then call for help, playing the role of the desperate mother trying to save her dying child. The children were so young, so fragile, that the evidence of suffocation was nearly impossible to detect with the forensic technology of the time. What made Mary Beth's crimes so particularly chilling was how she weaponized the most sacred bond in human society: the relationship between mother and child. She exploited society's reluctance to suspect a grieving mother, using cultural assumptions about maternal love as cover for her horrific acts. Who would question a woman who seemed so devoted to her children? Who would suspect that the same hands that changed diapers and prepared bottles were also instruments of murder? The medical community was baffled by the string of deaths, but they couldn't bring themselves to consider the obvious explanation. They invented elaborate theories about genetic disorders, environmental factors, anything to avoid confronting the possibility that a mother was systematically killing her own children. Even when the pattern became undeniable, many doctors and nurses refused to believe it. They'd seen Mary Beth's tears, witnessed her apparent anguish, watched her perform CPR on her dying children. How could someone fake that kind of grief? But Mary Beth wasn't faking the grief. That's what made her so dangerous. She genuinely mourned her children's deaths, even as she caused them. She loved them in her own twisted way, but she loved the attention their deaths brought her even more. She had discovered that tragedy was her ticket to significance, and she became addicted to the sympathy, the drama, the feeling of being the most important person in the room. The community of Schenectady was deeply affected by the Tinning family's apparent curse. Neighbors organized meal trains, fundraisers, and support groups. Local churches held special services. The local newspaper ran sympathetic stories about the family's struggles. Mary Beth became a minor celebrity, the tragic figure everyone knew and pitied. She was no longer invisible. The pattern continued for over a decade because each death was spaced out enough to seem like an isolated tragedy. Mary Beth was smart enough to vary the apparent causes, the timing, even the hospitals where she took her children. She moved between different doctors, different emergency rooms, different specialists, ensuring that no single medical professional saw the full picture. She was methodical, patient, and utterly ruthless in her manipulation of the system. The breakthrough came in 1985 with the death of 4-month-old Tammy Lynn. By then, advances in forensic pathology had made it possible to detect subtle signs of suffocation that earlier investigations had missed. More importantly, the sheer statistical impossibility of so many deaths in one family had finally triggered suspicion among medical professionals. Dr. Thomas Oram, the pediatrician who treated several of the Tinning children, began connecting the dots and contacted authorities. When investigators finally looked at the full scope of the deaths, the pattern was undeniable. The odds of 9 children in one family dying of natural causes were astronomical. Forensic re-examination of the evidence revealed subtle signs of suffocation that had been missed in earlier investigations. Most damning of all, when confronted with the evidence, Mary Beth confessed. Her confession was as chilling as her crimes. She showed no remorse, no understanding of the magnitude of what she'd done. She spoke about the murders with the same detached tone she might use to discuss the weather. She seemed genuinely puzzled by the investigators' horror, as if she couldn't understand why everyone was making such a big deal about it. During her trial, the prosecution painted a picture of a woman so desperate for attention that she was willing to sacrifice her own children to get it. The defense tried to argue that she was mentally ill, that the deaths were the result of some kind of psychotic break, but the evidence showed careful planning, deliberate action, and a clear understanding of right and wrong. Mary Beth Tinning wasn't insane. She was evil. In 1987, she was convicted of murdering Tammy Lynn and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. She was suspected in the deaths of all 9 children, but prosecutors decided to focus on the case where the evidence was strongest. She was eligible for parole multiple times over the decades, but each time, the parole board denied her release. The sheer scope of her crimes, the vulnerability of her victims, and her continued lack of remorse made her too dangerous to release. What makes the Mary Beth Tinning case so haunting isn't just the number of victims or the method of murder. It's the way she perverted the most fundamental human relationships and institutions. She turned motherhood into a weapon, hospitals into crime scenes, and grief into performance art. She exploited society's most basic assumptions about human nature and used them to get away with murder for over a decade. The case also revealed dangerous blind spots in the medical and social service systems. The reluctance to suspect a grieving mother, the failure to share information between different hospitals and doctors, the inadequate forensic techniques of the era, all combined to create an environment where Mary Beth could operate with impunity. Her crimes led to significant changes in how medical professionals approach cases of suspicious infant deaths and improved protocols for detecting and investigating potential child abuse. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Mary Beth Tinning represented a type of killer that challenges our most basic assumptions about human nature. We want to believe that mothers are inherently protective, that maternal love is unconditional and pure. But Mary Beth proved that even the most sacred bonds can be corrupted, that evil can wear the mask of love, and that sometimes the greatest danger to children comes from the very people who are supposed to protect them. She remained in prison until her death in 2023, having served over 35 years for her crimes. Even in her final years, she maintained her innocence in most of the deaths, continuing to play the role of the misunderstood mother who had been wrongly accused. But the evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable. 9 children had died by her hand, and countless others had been traumatized by her actions. The Mary Beth Tinning case stands as a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it whispers lullabies and wears the face of a loving mother. Sometimes the monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They're sitting in the front pew at church. They're organizing the school bake sale. They're the ones everyone feels sorry for. When most people picture a child killer, they imagine some shadowy figure lurking in playgrounds, someone obviously disturbed and dangerous. But what they don't picture is a soft-spoken mother from Schenectady, New York, cradling her infant in a hospital room, tears streaming down her face as doctors desperately try to save another dying baby. They don't picture Mary Beth Tinning, a woman who would become one of the most chilling examples of how evil can hide behind the most sacred of relationships, the bond between mother and child. Between 1972 and 1985, 9 children in the Tinning household would die. 9. The medical community called it tragic, unprecedented, a family cursed by unimaginable bad luck. Neighbors brought casseroles and offered prayers. But behind those tears, behind that grieving mother facade, was something far more sinister. Mary Beth Tinning wasn't losing her children to mysterious illnesses or genetic disorders. She was killing them one by one, methodically, patiently, and she was getting away with it because nobody, absolutely nobody, suspected that a mother could do such a thing. The Tinning case represents something that cuts to the very core of our understanding of evil. We expect monsters to look monstrous, to act suspiciously, to give us warning signs. But Mary Beth Tinning shattered that illusion completely. She was the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing, a predator who used society's most sacred assumptions about motherhood as her perfect cover. And for over a decade, it worked flawlessly. The story begins in 1972 when Mary Beth and her husband Joe welcomed their 3rd child, Jennifer, into the world. Their first 2 children had died in infancy, deaths that were attributed to natural causes, genetic issues that sometimes plague families. When Jennifer was born, the couple felt hope again, a chance for the family they'd always dreamed of. But that hope would be short-lived. On January 3rd, 1972, just 8 days after Jennifer's birth, Mary Beth rushed her to the hospital. The baby was unresponsive, her tiny body limp and cold. Despite frantic efforts by medical staff, Jennifer was pronounced dead. The cause of death was listed as sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, a mysterious condition that claims thousands of babies each year with no warning and no explanation. The community rallied around the grieving parents. Friends and family couldn't imagine the pain of losing 3 children. But if they had looked closer, if they had questioned the pattern, they might have noticed something disturbing. Mary Beth's reaction to these deaths wasn't quite right. While she cried and appeared devastated in public, those closest to her noticed an odd detachment, almost as if she was performing grief rather than feeling it. But who questions a grieving mother? Who looks for deception in tears? 2 years later, Mary Beth gave birth to Timothy. This time, she seemed more protective, more anxious about the baby's health. She frequently called the pediatrician with concerns, rushed to the hospital at the slightest sign of illness, and appeared to be the epitome of a worried mother trying to prevent another tragedy. But on December 10th, 1973, Timothy joined his siblings in death. Once again, SIDS was listed as the cause. Once again, the community mourned with the Tinnings. And once again, nobody suspected that these weren't acts of nature, but acts of murder. The pattern continued with horrifying regularity. Nathan was born in 1975 and died just months later. Mary Frances followed in 1988, living only a few weeks. Jonathan arrived in 1979, surviving for nearly 2 years before his mysterious death. Michael was born in 1980 and died at just over 2 months old. Mary Frances II was born in 1983 and died within days. Each death followed the same script: sudden illness, frantic rush to the hospital, devastated parents, and a medical community that couldn't explain what was happening. What makes the Tinning case so particularly disturbing is how she manipulated the medical system itself. Mary Beth had learned exactly what symptoms to report, how to present her children's conditions, and when to seek help. She would often arrive at the hospital with a child who appeared to be suffering from apnea, breathing difficulties that could easily be explained by various medical conditions. The doctors, seeing a pattern of infant deaths in the family, assumed they were dealing with a genetic predisposition to respiratory problems or some unknown hereditary condition. But Mary Beth wasn't just relying on medical ignorance. She was actively creating the symptoms she reported. Investigation would later reveal that she was likely suffocating her children, pressing pillows or her hands over their faces until they stopped breathing, then partially reviving them before rushing to the hospital. This created the perfect cover story: a child with genuine respiratory distress, a panicked mother seeking help, and medical professionals who saw exactly what they expected to see based on the family's tragic history. The psychological profile that emerged from the Tinning case is one of the most complex and disturbing in criminal history. Experts believe that Mary Beth suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition where a caregiver deliberately harms someone under their care to gain attention, sympathy, or psychological satisfaction. But this wasn't just about attention. This was about power, control, and a twisted form of emotional regulation that most people can't even begin to comprehend. For Mary Beth, the act of making her children sick, of rushing them to hospitals, of playing the role of the devoted, worried mother, fulfilled some deep psychological need. She craved the attention, the sympathy, the drama of medical emergencies. But more than that, she seemed to feed off the power she held over life and death. She could make her children sick, she could make them well, and ultimately, she could decide when their suffering would end forever. The community's response to the Tinning family's tragedies reveals something deeply unsettling about how we process information that doesn't fit our expectations. Neighbors, friends, even medical professionals saw the pattern of deaths but couldn't bring themselves to consider the most obvious explanation. The idea that a mother could systematically murder her own children was so far outside the realm of acceptable thought that it simply wasn't considered. This cognitive blind spot, this inability to see evil where we expect to find love, is what allowed Mary Beth to continue killing for over a decade. But Mary Beth's luck finally ran out with her ninth victim, Tommy Lynn, born in August 1985. By this time, the pattern of deaths in the Tinning household had become impossible to ignore. When 3-month-old Tommy Lynn was rushed to the hospital in December 1985, unresponsive and near death, medical staff had finally begun to ask the questions that should have been asked years earlier. The hospital contacted authorities, and for the first time, the death of a Tinning child was investigated as a potential homicide. The investigation revealed a pattern so clear, so undeniable, that it's almost impossible to understand how it went undetected for so long. 9 children, all dying under similar circumstances, all in the care of the same person. The statistical probability of such a cluster of deaths occurring naturally was virtually zero. Medical experts who reviewed the cases concluded that the children had been systematically murdered, most likely through suffocation. When confronted with the evidence, Mary Beth initially maintained her innocence, playing the role of the grieving mother one final time. But eventually, under intense questioning, cracks began to appear in her facade. On February 5th, 1987, she confessed to killing 3 of her children, Timothy, Nathan, and Tommy Lynn. But even in confession, she couldn't bring herself to admit the full scope of her crimes, maintaining that the other deaths were natural, even though the evidence suggested otherwise. The confession itself was chilling in its casualness. Mary Beth described the murders without emotion, almost as if she was discussing routine household tasks. She explained how she would smother the children with pillows or by pressing her hand over their mouths and noses. She described watching them struggle, watching the life drain from their eyes, and then calmly calling for help or rushing them to the hospital. There was no remorse, no explanation that made sense, just a cold, matter-of-fact recounting of infanticide. During her trial, the prosecution painted a picture of a woman who had turned motherhood into a twisted game of life and death. They argued that Mary Beth had become addicted to the attention and sympathy that came with having sick and dying children, and that when the attention began to fade, she would create new medical crises to regain the spotlight. The defense tried to argue that she was mentally ill, that her actions were the result of psychological disorders that diminished her responsibility. But the systematic nature of her crimes, the careful planning, and the years of deception suggested someone who knew exactly what she was doing. On July 17th, 1987, Mary Beth Tinning was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Tommy Lynn and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. She was not charged with the other deaths, partly due to the difficulty of proving murder in cases where the bodies had been buried for years, and partly because the conviction on one count was sufficient to ensure she would never harm another child. The Tinning case sent shockwaves through the medical community and forced a complete reevaluation of how suspicious patterns of child deaths are investigated. It led to the development of new protocols for identifying potential cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy and created awareness among healthcare providers about the possibility that caregivers themselves might be the source of their children's medical problems. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Tinning case is what it reveals about the nature of evil itself. This wasn't a crime of passion a momentary lapse in judgment, or even a response to desperate circumstances. This was calculated, systematic, and sustained over more than a decade. Mary Beth Tinning made a conscious choice, again and again, to end the lives of her own children for reasons that most people will never be able to comprehend. The case also highlights the dangerous power of societal expectations and assumptions. The idea that mothers are inherently protective of their children is so deeply ingrained in our culture that it created a perfect blind spot for a predator to exploit. Mary Beth understood this instinctively and used society's trust in maternal love as her weapon. She knew that tears and panic would be interpreted as evidence of innocence rather than signs of guilt. Even today, decades after her conviction, Mary Beth Tinning remains something of an enigma. She has shown no remorse for her crimes, offered no meaningful explanation for her actions, and maintained a cold detachment that chills everyone who encounters her. She was denied parole multiple times, with the parole board noting her lack of insight into her crimes and her continued potential danger to society. Mary Beth Tinning represents the darkest possible corruption of one of humanity's most sacred relationships. She took the trust, love, and vulnerability that define the bond between parent and child and weaponized them for her own twisted purposes. She turned nurseries into crime scenes, hospitals into stages for her performances, and the very act of motherhood into a cover for serial murder. The 9 children who died at her hands never had a chance. They trusted her completely, depended on her absolutely, and loved her unconditionally. And she used that trust, that dependence, that love, to destroy them. When you dig deeper into the case of Mary Beth Tinning, you realize that this wasn't just about a mother losing children. This was about a woman who discovered that tragedy brought her something she'd never had before: attention, sympathy, and a twisted form of love. Each death made her the center of a community's grief, surrounded by caring neighbors, concerned doctors, and a grieving husband who held her close. The problem was, once the attention faded, once people moved on with their lives, Mary Beth was left empty again, and she knew exactly how to fill that void. The pattern was sickeningly consistent. A child would fall ill suddenly, often with symptoms that seemed to come from nowhere. Mary Beth would rush them to the hospital, playing the role of the frantic, devoted mother. She'd hold vigil by their bedside, accepting comfort from nurses and doctors who admired her strength. When the child inevitably died, she'd be surrounded by an outpouring of community support. Casseroles would arrive at her door, phone calls would pour in. People would tell her how strong she was, how much they admired her courage in the face of such unimaginable loss. For a woman who had felt invisible her entire life, this attention was intoxicating. But here's what makes Mary Beth Tinning's case so particularly disturbing. She wasn't killing strangers. She wasn't targeting vulnerable people on the margins of society. She was systematically murdering her own children, the very people she was supposed to protect above all else. The maternal instinct, that primal drive to keep your offspring safe, had been completely twisted into something monstrous. She was using her children as instruments to feed her own psychological needs, treating them not as human beings, but as props in her ongoing performance of grief. The methods she used were particularly cruel because they were so subtle. Unlike other killers who used obvious violence, Mary Beth employed suffocation, a method that left few traces and could easily be mistaken for natural causes. She would wait until she was alone with a child, then calmly place a pillow over their face or pinch their nose and mouth closed. The child would struggle, fight for air, but Mary Beth would hold firm until the fighting stopped. Then she would remove the pillow, compose herself, and call for help, playing the role of the horrified mother who had just discovered her child not breathing. What's even more chilling is that she did this repeatedly, over the course of 13 years, and each time she got better at it. She learned which symptoms to report, which emotions to display, how to time her discovery of the child's distress for maximum impact. She became a master manipulator, not just of her victims, but of an entire community that rallied around her in her supposed time of need. The case that finally exposed her was the death of Tammy Lynn, her 4-month-old daughter, in 1985. By this point, even the most sympathetic observers were beginning to question how one family could suffer so much tragedy. When Tammy Lynn died under circumstances that mirrored all the previous deaths, investigators finally decided to take a closer look. The autopsy revealed evidence of asphyxiation, and for the first time, authorities began to connect the dots between all the deaths in the Tinning household. During the investigation, a disturbing picture emerged. Neighbors recalled how Mary Beth seemed almost energized by tragedy, how she appeared to thrive on the attention that came with each death. Medical records showed a pattern of suspicious symptoms that didn't quite add up to natural causes. Most damning of all, the statistical impossibility of so many children dying from natural causes in a single family became impossible to ignore. When confronted with the evidence, Mary Beth initially maintained her innocence, playing the role of the grieving mother one last time. But eventually, faced with overwhelming evidence, she confessed to killing 3 of her children, though investigators suspected her in all 9 deaths. Even in her confession, there was something cold and calculated about her demeanor. She showed no real remorse, no genuine grief for what she had done. Instead, she seemed almost relieved that her secret was finally out. The psychological evaluation that followed revealed a woman who had been living a double life for over a decade. On the surface, she appeared to be a devoted mother, a pillar of her community, someone who had endured unimaginable tragedy with grace and strength. But underneath, she was a calculating killer who had discovered that murder could be a pathway to the love and attention she craved. Mary Beth Tinning was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, where she remains today. She's been denied parole multiple times, and each time she maintains that she's a changed person, that she deserves a second chance. But the families of her victims, the community she deceived, and the justice system that finally caught her all know the truth. She's a woman who turned motherhood into a weapon, who used the most sacred bond in human society as a cover for serial murder. Her case stands as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears the face of a grieving mother. It speaks in the voice of someone seeking comfort. It hides behind the very emotions we're taught to respect and protect. The most dangerous predators aren't always the ones lurking in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. What makes these final cases so disturbing isn't just the scale of their crimes, but how they operated in plain sight, manipulating trust and exploiting the most vulnerable members of society. These killers didn't lurk in shadows or abandoned buildings. They lived among us, smiled at neighbors, and built reputations as caregivers and community members while systematically destroying lives. The truly chilling aspect of these cases is how long they went undetected. Mary Beth Tinning murdered her own children for 13 years before anyone questioned the pattern. The Hemlock Valley killer continues to walk free decades later, despite leaving DNA evidence at crime scenes. Gary Sari crossed international borders, changed his identity, and killed for years before modern genealogy technology finally caught up to him long after his death. These weren't crimes of passion or momentary breakdowns. They were calculated, methodical, and sustained over years, or even decades. Each killer perfected their methods, learned from close calls, and adapted their techniques to avoid detection. They understood that certain victims would be overlooked, certain deaths would go unquestioned, and certain patterns would remain invisible to overworked investigators. The forensic breakthroughs that solved some of these cases represent a new era in criminal investigation. The Calgary cases were cracked using investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that builds family trees from DNA evidence to identify suspects who never entered the criminal justice system. This technology has revolutionized cold case investigations, but it also reveals how many killers operated with impunity before these tools existed. What's particularly haunting is how these killers exploited societal blind spots. Dorothea Puente knew that elderly, disabled tenants living on the margins would rarely be missed. The Hemlock Valley killer understood that sex workers and addicts were seen as disposable by much of society. Nanny Doss recognized that a grieving widow would never be suspected of poisoning her husbands. These killers didn't just murder individuals, they exploited systemic failures in how we protect the vulnerable. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal disturbing commonalities. Many showed early signs of antisocial behavior that went untreated. They displayed remarkable patience, sometimes waiting years between victims or carefully grooming their targets over extended periods. They were skilled manipulators who could present themselves as helpful, caring, or trustworthy when it served their purposes. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how they rationalized their crimes. Puente saw herself as providing a service to society by housing difficult tenants. Doss believed she was freeing herself from unhappy marriages. Tinning craved the sympathy and attention that came with being a grieving mother. They created elaborate mental frameworks that justified their actions, allowing them to continue killing while maintaining their public personas. The victims in these cases were often society's most vulnerable members. Elderly tenants with no family, troubled teenagers, struggling addicts, infants who couldn't defend themselves. These killers understood that certain victims wouldn't be thoroughly investigated, that their disappearances might be explained away, and that their deaths could be attributed to natural causes or lifestyle factors. The investigation challenges in these cases highlight the limitations of law enforcement across different eras. Before DNA testing, investigators relied on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and confessions. Communication between jurisdictions was limited, allowing killers like Sari to cross borders and assume new identities. The lack of centralized databases meant that patterns spanning years or different locations often went unnoticed. Modern forensic science has solved some of these cases, but it's also revealed how many more remain unsolved. For every Gary Serreri identified through genetic genealogy, there are likely dozens of other unknown killers whose crimes remain hidden in cold case files. The technology that finally caught these predators also shows us how many victims never received justice. The psychological impact on communities and families affected by these crimes cannot be overstated. Parents who lost children to Mary Beth Tinning lived with guilt and confusion for decades. Families of Hemlock Valley victims still don't know who killed their daughters. The boarding house tenants who escaped Dorothea Puente's house carry survivors' guilt. These crimes create ripple effects that last generations. What makes these killers so terrifying isn't just what they did, but how easily they could have continued. If not for a suspicious doctor in Nanny Doss's case, a concerned social worker in Puente's case, or advances in DNA technology for the Calgary murders, these killing sprees might have continued indefinitely. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about how many predators might still be operating undetected in our communities. The most chilling realization from studying these cases is how they reveal the fragility of the systems designed to protect us. Foster care failed Gary Serreri. The medical system failed to identify Mary Beth Tinning's pattern of child deaths. Social services failed to properly monitor Dorothea Puente's boarding house. These failures weren't just bureaucratic oversights, they were matters of life and death. These cases also demonstrate how evil can hide behind the most innocent facades. A grandmother tending her garden, a mother cradling her sick child, a wife cooking dinner for her husband. The most dangerous predators aren't the ones who look the part. They're the ones who understand that appearing normal, helpful, and trustworthy is the perfect camouflage for the darkest intentions. The legacy of these killers serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears a friendly smile, offers help to those in need, and builds a reputation as a pillar of the community. The darkness that lurks within the human heart often hides behind the most ordinary faces. We've seen how predators disguise themselves as caregivers, how they exploit trust and manipulate systems designed to protect the vulnerable. But what happens when that darkness manifests in the most sacred of relationships, when the very person meant to nurture and protect becomes the source of unimaginable horror? This brings us to our final case, one that challenges everything we believe about maternal instinct and the bonds that should be unbreakable. Mary Beth Tinning appeared to be a grieving mother, a woman cursed by tragedy after tragedy. Between 1972 and 1985, she lost 9 children, 9. Each death was attributed to natural causes, sudden infant death syndrome, or mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't fully explain. The community rallied around her, offering support and sympathy for a woman who seemed to face incomprehensible loss. But behind those tears, behind the facade of a devastated mother, was something far more sinister. Mary Beth Tinning wasn't a victim of cruel fate. She was the architect of her own children's deaths, systematically murdering them one by one, then basking in the attention and sympathy that followed. She represents perhaps the most disturbing type of killer we've encountered, one who destroys the very lives she brought into the world. Mary Beth Rowe was born in 1942 in Duanesburg, New York, into a family that seemed ordinary enough on the surface. But beneath that veneer of normalcy lay dysfunction and emotional neglect that would shape her into something monstrous. Her father was distant and critical, her mother cold and withholding of affection. Mary Beth grew up craving attention, validation, any sign that she mattered to someone, anyone. As a young woman, she married Joseph Tinning, a man who worked at General Electric and seemed to offer the stability she'd never known. They settled into what appeared to be a conventional life in Schenectady, New York. Joseph was hardworking, was reliable, the kind of man who came home every evening and expected dinner on the table. But for Mary Beth, conventional wasn't enough. She needed drama, excitement, something to make her feel alive and important. The pattern began in 1972 with the death of their first child, Jennifer. The baby died of hemorrhagic meningitis, a legitimate medical condition that no one questioned. For most parents, such a loss would be devastating beyond words. For Mary Beth, it was something else entirely. She discovered that grief brought her something she'd never experienced before: attention, sympathy, people caring about her pain and wanting to help. The community embraced her, offering condolences and support. Church members brought casseroles, neighbors stopped by to check on her, and for the first time in her life, Mary Beth felt truly seen. She wasn't just another housewife in a small town. She was special. She was the woman who had suffered an unimaginable loss, and everyone wanted to comfort her. But that attention was finite. As weeks turned to months, people moved on with their lives. The casseroles stopped coming, the phone calls became less frequent, and Mary Beth found herself once again invisible, ordinary, forgotten. That's when she made a decision that would define the rest of her life and cost 8 more children theirs. She would create more tragedy, more reasons for people to care about her. 2 months after Jennifer's death, Mary Beth's son, Joseph Jr., died suddenly. The official cause was listed as sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, a diagnosis that was unfortunately common and rarely questioned in the 1970s. Once again, the community rallied around the grieving mother. Once again, Mary Beth became the center of attention and sympathy. What no one realized was that Joseph Jr. hadn't died of natural causes. Mary Beth had suffocated him, holding a pillow over his tiny face until his struggles ceased. She had murdered her own child for the simple, twisted reason that she missed being the focus of everyone's concern. The attention that followed his death was intoxicating, validating her decision in the most horrific way possible. The deaths continued with terrifying regularity. Barbara in 1973, Timothy in 1973, Nathan in 1975, Mary Frances in 1979, Jonathan in 1980, Michael in 1981, and finally Tammy Lynn in 1985. Each death followed the same pattern. A healthy child would suddenly fall ill or simply stop breathing. Mary Beth would rush them to the hospital, playing the role of the frantic mother, but it was always too late. Her methods were as cruel as they were calculated. She would smother the children with pillows, suffocate them with plastic bags, or administer fatal doses of medication. The murders were committed in the privacy of her own home, in the quiet moments when Joseph was at work and no one else was around to witness her crimes. She became an expert at timing, ensuring that enough time passed after each death to avoid suspicion, but not so much that people forgot about her tragedy. The medical community, limited by the technology and knowledge of the time, couldn't identify the true cause of these deaths. SIDS was poorly understood, and multiple infant deaths in one family, while unusual, weren't unheard of. Some families seemed genetically predisposed to losing children, and doctors often attributed such patterns to hereditary factors or environmental causes they couldn't identify. But Mary Beth's hunger for attention extended beyond just the immediate aftermath of each death. She would attend support groups for bereaved parents where she could share her story and receive ongoing sympathy. She became known in these circles as the woman who had lost so many children, and other grieving parents would look to her for strength and guidance. She reveled in this role, positioning herself as an expert on loss and grief. The facade began to crack with the death of Tammy Lynn in 1985. By this point, some members of the medical community were beginning to ask questions. 9 deaths in one family was beyond statistical possibility, even accounting for genetic factors or environmental causes. Dr. Thomas Oram, who had treated several of the Tinning children, began to suspect that something wasn't right. When Tammy Lynn died, she was brought to the hospital with symptoms that didn't quite fit any known medical condition. Her breathing had stopped suddenly, and despite efforts to revive her, she couldn't be saved. But this time, the hospital decided to conduct a more thorough investigation. An autopsy was performed, and while it didn't reveal an obvious cause of death, it raised enough questions to warrant further scrutiny. The breakthrough came when investigators began looking at the statistical probability of so many deaths in one family. They consulted with experts in pediatric medicine and forensic pathology who confirmed that the odds of 9 natural deaths in one family were virtually impossible. The pattern was too consistent, the timing too convenient, and the circumstances too similar to be coincidental. In 1986, Mary Beth Tinning was arrested and charged with the murder of Tammy Lynn. During interrogation, she initially denied any wrongdoing, maintaining her role as the grieving mother who had been cursed with unimaginable loss. But as the evidence mounted and the pressure increased, she finally broke down and confessed. Her confession was chilling in its casualness. She described the murders with little emotion, explaining how she had killed each child and why. The motive was always the same. She wanted attention, sympathy, to feel important and cared for. She admitted that she had enjoyed the aftermath of each death, the way people would flock to comfort her and make her feel special. What made her confession even more disturbing was her complete lack of remorse. She didn't seem to understand why people were so horrified by her actions. In her mind, she had simply found a way to get the attention she craved, and the fact that it came at the cost of her children's lives seemed almost incidental to her. The trial in 1987 was a media sensation. The idea of a mother systematically murdering her own children was so foreign, so fundamentally wrong, that it captivated and horrified the public. Mary Beth was portrayed as a monster, a woman who had perverted the most basic human instinct to protect one's offspring. During the proceedings, psychologists and psychiatrists testified about her mental state. They diagnosed her with various personality disorders, including narcissistic personality disorder and factitious disorder by proxy, now known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This condition involves a caregiver deliberately causing harm to someone under their care in order to gain attention and sympathy. But regardless of the psychological explanations, the facts remained unchanged. Mary Beth Tinning had murdered 9 children, her own children, for the simple reason that she enjoyed the attention their deaths brought her. She was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Tammy Lynn and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. The case had broader implications for the medical community and child protective services. It highlighted the need for better protocols when multiple unexplained deaths occur in one family. It also raised questions about how society responds to tragedy and whether that response can sometimes enable and encourage dangerous behavior. Mary Beth Tinning represents the ultimate betrayal of trust. As mothers, women are expected to be the ultimate protectors of their children, willing to sacrifice anything to keep them safe. She turned that expectation on its head, using her role as a mother to create victims and her position as a grieving parent to avoid suspicion. Today, she remains incarcerated, having been denied parole multiple times. Each time she appears before the parole board, she maintains her innocence regarding the other deaths, admitting only to the murder of Tommy Lynn. She claims to have found religion in prison and expresses remorse for her actions, but her refusal to acknowledge the full extent of her crimes suggests that she still doesn't fully understand the magnitude of what she did. The Tinning case serves as a stark reminder that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places, even from those we trust most completely. It shows us that the desire for attention and validation can corrupt even the most fundamental human relationships, turning love into manipulation and care into murder. These 5 cases, from Dorothea Puente's boarding house of horrors to Mary Beth Tinning's systematic infanticide, reveal the many faces of evil that hide in plain sight. They show us that monsters don't always lurk in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they're the helpful landlady, the caring mother, the friendly neighbor who always has a smile and a kind word. They exploit our basic human tendency to trust, to believe that people are fundamentally good, and to give others the benefit of the doubt. They understand that society has blind spots, vulnerable populations that are easy to victimize and difficult to protect. And they use these weaknesses to their advantage, operating for years or even decades before being caught. The advances in forensic science that finally brought some of these killers to justice offer hope that future predators will be caught sooner. DNA analysis, digital surveillance, and better communication between law enforcement agencies make it harder for killers to operate undetected. But technology alone isn't enough. We also need to remain vigilant, to pay attention to patterns and inconsistencies, and to speak up when something doesn't seem right. Perhaps most importantly, these cases remind us that evil is real, that it exists in our communities and institutions, and that eternal vigilance is the price of protecting the innocent. The victims of these killers, the elderly, the homeless, the children, the vulnerable, deserve our protection and our memory. The psychology of these killers reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature. Each one exploited fundamental weaknesses in society's protection systems. They understood that certain populations were invisible, that certain relationships were sacred, and that certain appearances were beyond suspicion. They weaponized trust itself. What makes these cases particularly chilling is how they demonstrate the evolution of criminal investigation. Gary Serreri's decades-old crimes were only solved through cutting-edge genetic genealogy technology. The Hemlock Valley murders remain unsolved, their perpetrator potentially still alive, potentially still dangerous. These cases show us how killers can slip through the cracks of time, geography, and jurisdiction. The most disturbing aspect isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but their calculated patience. Dorothea Puente spent years building her reputation as a caring landlady before systematically murdering her tenants. Nanny Doss giggled her way through 4 marriages, each ending in death. Mary Beth Tinning appeared to be a grieving mother while methodically suffocating her own children. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated campaigns of murder disguised as normalcy. Consider the societal blind spots these killers exploited. The elderly and disabled residents of Puente's boarding house were society's forgotten people. Their disappearances went unnoticed because they existed on the margins. The sex workers in the Hemlock Valley were vulnerable precisely because their lives were already precarious. These killers understood that some victims matter less to society, and they used that knowledge to their advantage. The forensic limitations of their eras also played crucial roles. Dorothea Puente operated in an age before comprehensive background checks and digital tracking. Nanny Doss killed in a time when arsenic poisoning could easily be mistaken for natural causes. Mary Beth Tinning exploited an era when SIDS was poorly understood and rarely questioned. These killers thrived in the gaps of knowledge and technology. But perhaps most terrifying is how they maintained their facades. Puente was known for her homemade tamales and beautiful garden. Doss was remembered as a giggling, harmless grandmother. Tinning was seen as a devoted mother facing unimaginable tragedy. They understood that appearing normal, even admirable, was their greatest protection. They knew that people don't suspect monsters who look like themselves. The investigation techniques that finally brought some of these killers to justice represent quantum leaps in forensic science. The genetic genealogy that identified Gary Sari would have seemed like science fiction when he was committing his crimes in the 1970s. But for every case that technology has solved, others remain frustratingly open. The Hemlock Valley killer may never be identified. Other victims of these killers may never be found. These cases also reveal the psychological toll on investigators and communities. The detectives who spent decades trying to solve the Calgary murders never stopped searching. The families of victims waited years for answers that might never come. The communities where these killers operated lived with the knowledge that evil had walked among them, undetected and unrepentant. What's particularly haunting is how these killers viewed their victims. They weren't seen as human beings with families, dreams, and fears. They were objects to be manipulated, used, and discarded. Puente saw her tenants as sources of income to be harvested. Doss saw her husbands as obstacles to her romantic fantasies. Tinning saw her children as extensions of herself to be controlled. This humanization is perhaps the most chilling aspect of their psychology. The aftermath of these cases continues to ripple through society. Puente's former boarding house has become a macabre tourist attraction. The communities where these killers operated still carry the scars of their crimes. Families of victims struggle with questions that will never be answered. The knowledge that such evil can hide behind such ordinary facades changes how we view the world around us. These 5 killers represent different faces of evil, but they share common traits that should terrify us all. They were patient, calculating, and utterly without remorse. They understood human psychology well enough to exploit it. They recognized society's blind spots and used them as hunting grounds. Most importantly, they proved that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flair. Sometimes it knocks on your door with a smile, offers you a cup of tea, and asks how you're feeling. The lesson from these cases isn't just about criminal justice or forensic science. It's about vigilance, about the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members, and about the sobering reality that monsters don't always look like monsters. They look like landlords, grandmothers, and grieving mothers. They look like us. As we continue to develop new technologies and investigative techniques, we must remember that evil adapts too. The killers of tomorrow will find new ways to exploit society's weaknesses, new facades to hide behind, new victims to target. The only defense is awareness, vigilance, and the understanding that evil can wear any face, live on any street, and hide behind any smile. These 5 killers you've never heard of are reminders that the most dangerous predators are often the ones we never see coming. They walked among us, lived among us, and killed among us while we remained blissfully unaware. That's the most terrifying lesson of all.